Gentlemen, war has a terrible habit of erasing who you were and replacing it with exactly who you need to be to survive. Take a look at August 8, 1941. It is 5:47 in the morning near Belalayka, Ukraine. Crouched behind a pile of rubble is a 24-year-old girl named Lyudmila Pavlichenko. In her hands, she holds a standard-issue Mosin Nagant rifle with just 40 rounds of ammunition. To the casual observer, she looks like a recruit who got lost on the way to the field hospital. But Lyudmila isn't there to patch wounds. She is staring through a scope at a German sniper 280 meters away, a man currently hunting her comrade, Sergeant Dmitry Kravchenko. This moment is the dividing line. On one side of this line, you have Lyudmila, the history student from Kiev University. Just 11 days prior, her life was textbooks and lectures. Then the Luftwaffe arrived. The bombs fell on the university, burying her professor, Dr. Vulov, under the masonry and trapping her best friend, Natasha, in a burning library. That version of Lyudmila died in the fire with Natasha. The woman who walked into the recruiting office the next morning was something else entirely. When the recruiting officer took one look at her and told her to become a nurse because women belonged in medical units, she didn't flinch. She told him she'd been shooting since she was 14, tearing up targets in regional competitions. The officer laughed at her. He told her that shooting paper targets wasn't combat. Combat was blood and screaming. He wanted to embarrass her, so he handed her a rifle and pointed to a fence post. 100 meters downrange, she put 5 rounds through the center of it. The officer stopped laughing. Now, 4 months later, that history student is gone. Lyudmila is part of the 25th Rifle Division, facing down 3 full divisions of the Wehrmacht, 150,000 German soldiers advancing on Odessa. The Soviets are outnumbered 3-1. The unit is losing men faster than they can train them. And as she watches that German helmet move behind a farmhouse wall, 280 meters away, she isn't thinking about history. Her instructor's voice is echoing in her head. Don't think about killing. Think about solving a problem. It's mathematics, not murder. She adjusts for a light crosswind. She settles the crosshairs, and she squeezes the trigger. The German helmet jerks backward. He disappears. In that split second, the student officially became the soldier. She felt no guilt. She felt no satisfaction. She simply asked herself one cold, practical question. Where is the next one? She had just notched her first confirmed kill. She had 309 more to go, but simply being a good shot wasn't going to be enough, because the Germans weren't just sending infantry anymore, they were sending their own elite hunters. And to beat them, Lyudmila would have to do something that Soviet doctrine explicitly forbade. In the early months of the war, the Red Army Sniper Manual was treated like holy scripture. It was rigid, specific, and on paper, it made perfect tactical sense. The doctrine was built on a single, unwavering pillar. Concealment is survival. The rules were drilled into every recruit until they could recite them in their sleep. Never expose your position, never stay in one place for more than 30 minutes, and never fire more than 3 shots from the same location. The logic was simple. You take your shot, you drop out of sight, and you move immediately to a secondary position to avoid the return fire. It was a defensive strategy designed to keep soldiers alive. But in the ruins of Ukraine, against the seasoned veterans of the Wehrmacht, this doctrine wasn't a shield. It was a road map to the grave. Lyudmila learned this lesson the hard way, by watching her friends die while doing exactly what they were told. The first major loss was Lieutenant Anna Morozova on August 19, 1941. Morozova wasn't a rookie. She was a capable sniper with 47 confirmed kills who played by the book. During an engagement in a bombed-out apartment building, she executed the Soviet doctrine flawlessly. She set up on the 3rd floor with excellent sight lines and planned 2 distinct exit routes. She took a shot at a German machine gun crew at 320 meters. 1 shot, 1 kill. She didn't celebrate. She immediately relocated to the 2nd floor, waited 20 minutes, and engaged a German officer. Another clean kill. Then, following protocol, she began moving to her tertiary position on the ground floor. That was when the German sniper, Hans Becker, put a bullet through her chest. Becker was a specialist in counter-sniper operations with 89 kills to his name. He hadn't just been watching for muzzle flashes. He had been studying the Soviet playbook. He knew that after the first shot, the Russian sniper would move down. He anticipated her route, positioned himself to intercept her exit, and killed her through a stairwell window. Morozova followed the rules perfectly, and she died because the rules made her predictable. 8 days later, the lesson was repeated with brutal efficiency. Corporal Viktor Stepanov, a 19-year-old kid eager to prove himself, set up in a drainage ditch 400 meters from the German lines. It was textbook positioning, perfect concealment, and low to the ground. He engaged a patrol at dawn, dropping 2 Germans, and then hunkered down. He didn't run. He stayed low and waited 15 minutes, preparing to move to a secondary position, just as his instructors had taught him. But the Germans didn't bother sending a sniper to find him. They simply triangulated the sound of his shots, estimated his position in the ditch, and called in an artillery strike. A shell landed directly on him. There was nothing left to bury. By September, Lyudmila had watched 7 snipers die. Every single one of them had followed orders. They had prioritized concealment. They had fired cautiously, and they had moved predictably. Lyudmila realized that the Germans' counter-sniper units, men like Becker, were too skilled for standard tactics. They knew exactly how Soviet snipers operated. They knew that if a Russian fired from a window, they would appear in the doorway 5 minutes later. Fighting defensively meant waiting for targets to appear, which ceded all control of the engagement to the enemy. The Germans didn't wait. They hunted actively. They created targets by forcing Soviet snipers to react, and then they punished that reaction. Lyudmila understood that she was standing at a precipice. If she continued to follow the Soviet manual, she would eventually be the 8th dead friend. The doctrine said exposure was death, but the reality of the battlefield proved that concealment was just a slower form of suicide. To survive, she had to stop being the prey. She had to become the predator, and that meant breaking the most fundamental rule of sniper warfare. Lyudmila Pavlichenko realized that to survive the German war machine, she had to stop acting like a soldier and start thinking like a hunter. The problem wasn't marksmanship. Soviet snipers could shoot just fine. The problem was that they fought defensively, waiting for targets to appear, which allowed the Germans to control the engagement. German snipers like Hans Becker didn't wait. They created targets, forcing the Soviets to expose themselves. Lyudmila decided to reverse that dynamic. She would do something that Soviet doctrine explicitly forbade. She would expose herself deliberately. The tactic she invented was, by conventional military standards, suicidal. It required precision timing, perfect positioning, and nerves of steel. It relied on a setup known as the dual nest. Instead of one concealed position, Lyudmila would prepare 2, spaced only 4 to 6 meters apart. This distance was critical, close enough to traverse in seconds, but far enough that fire directed at one wouldn't necessarily hit the other. Here is how the trap worked. In the primary nest, she placed a decoy. This wasn't high-tech deception. It was battlefield improvisation, a helmet on a stick, or a spare tunic stuffed with straw and leaves. Anything that, through a scope at 300 meters, looked like a careless Soviet soldier. Lyudmila would then conceal herself in the secondary nest, completely invisible, rifle-trained not on the German lines generally, but on the specific spots where a counter-sniper would likely hide. Then she waited. This was the hardest part. The wait could last for hours. Muscles ached, eyes watered from staring through the scope, and insects crawled over her hands, but she could not move. She had to wait for the German to take the bait. When the German sniper fired at the decoy, the muzzle flash would betray his position. This initiated a deadly countdown. Lyudmila calculated she had a window of exactly 2 to 4 seconds. That was the time it took for the German to recoil, look through his scope, and realize the soldier he just shot wasn't. Bleeding, but was merely a helmet on a stick. In those few seconds of confusion, the German was vulnerable. Lyudmila would acquire the target, aim, and fire. If she missed, the German would spot her muzzle flash and she would be dead. If she hit, she had to move immediately to a new location before his unit returned fire. She tested this insanity for the first time on September 3rd, 1941. She set up a decoy in a ruined cellar and hid 5 meters to the right. After 45 minutes of agonizing stillness, a shot cracked out at 6:17 a.m. The decoy helmet spun. Lyudmila spotted the muzzle flash 320 meters away behind a brick wall. She didn't hesitate. She fired at the shape in the shadows. Later, she watched through her scope as 2 German soldiers dragged a body away. The theory was sound. Over the next 6 weeks, she refined the science of the trap. She studied her enemy obsessively. She learned that German snipers preferred elevated positions, second or third floors of buildings, because they offered better sight lines. They avoided ground level because Soviet artillery usually targeted the ground floor first. She also noticed they liked to position themselves with the sun at their backs. Lyudmila used this against them. She built her secondary nests at ground level, where the Germans least expected a sniper to be. She timed her engagements so the sun would be in the Germans' eyes, blinding them while illuminating her decoy. It was a game of chess played with high-caliber rounds. The decoy was the opening move. The German's shot was the response. Her shot was checkmate. The effectiveness of this tactic was proven during a request from a Lieutenant Volkov on October 12th. His platoon was pinned down by a German sniper who had killed 9 men in 4 days near a railway junction. The German was a ghost, never firing from the same place twice. Lyudmila scouted the area and identified 11 possible firing positions. It was too many to watch at once. She had to force him to reveal himself. She set a decoy to be visible from 8 of those 11 positions and waited. For 40 minutes, the decoy stood in the open. Finally, at 7:11 a.m., the German fired. The shot came from inside a destroyed boxcar, a position Lyudmila hadn't prioritized because it seemed too exposed to artillery. But the German had gambled that the Soviets wouldn't waste shells on a single train car. He was right, until he took the bait. Lyudmila saw the movement in the boxcar and put 2 rounds into him. She began leaving her own psychological signatures. Sometimes she would leave a piece of ribbon near her shooting position after she vacated it. Other times, she would place a playing card on the body of a dead German sniper, the Red Queen. It was a message. I was here. I killed you, and I can do it again. By October, word had spread. The Germans were terrified of the Russian girl. They put a bounty on her head that rose from 100 to 1,000 Reichsmarks. Their propaganda called her a myth or a man in disguise because they couldn't believe a woman could kill with such cold, mathematical precision. But Lyudmila wasn't a myth. She was simply a soldier who had realized that in a war of annihilation, the rules of doctrine were just suggestions. The only rule that mattered was survival. By November 1941, the war had shifted to the besieged port city of Sevastopol. The situation was beyond desperate. Soviet defenders were holding on to the city by their fingernails, with ammunition rationed and food running out. But for the men on the ground, the immediate terror wasn't the shortage of supplies, it was a ghost. A single German sniper had arrived in the sector and systematically begun decapitating the Soviet command structure. In just 3 days, he had killed 11 soldiers, all officers, sergeants, or radio operators. He didn't shoot random infantry. He shot the people who gave the orders. The psychological impact was devastating. Officers were terrified to show their faces, and the entire platoon was paralyzed. Major Chernov called Lyudmila to headquarters and laid out the grim reality. She had 48 hours to find and kill this man, or the sector's defense would collapse. Lyudmila accepted the mission, not out of hubris, but because this was exactly what she had trained for. She approached it not as a duel of reflexes, but as a forensic investigation. She studied the photographs of the dead men. Every entry wound indicated perfect placement, single shots to the head or chest. This wasn't a lucky infantryman. This was a master. She plotted the kill locations on a map. They were all within a 400-meter radius, and crucially, they all occurred in the early morning between 5:45 and 7:30 a.m. The German was disciplined. He struck during the morning shift changes when Soviet officers were most visible and guards were tired. However, he never fired from the same location twice. One day the shot came from the northeast, the next from the southwest. He was following doctrine perfectly. Shoot, move, vanish. To catch him, Lyudmila had to understand the terrain better than he did. She teamed up with Lieutenant Boris, a reconnaissance officer who knew every ruin in Sevastopol. They walked the perimeter at night, dangerously close to German patrols, so Lyudmila could see the battlefield from ground level. The area was a nightmare of urban combat. Collapsed buildings, mountains of rubble, and thousands of potential hiding spots. But a sniper has specific needs. He needs a clear line of sight to his target and a secure escape route. Lyudmila looked at the command post, where the officers congregated, and reverse-engineered the Germans' potential hides. She identified 14 positions that offered the necessary views. It was too many to watch. She had to narrow it down. She filtered the locations based on the German's habits. He liked elevation. He liked the morning sun. She whittled the list down to 3. The north tower of a destroyed church, the 3rd floor of a collapsed apartment building, and the rooftop of a former school. Then Lyudmila made a decision that terrified even her. Decoys, helmets on sticks, might not fool a sniper of this caliber. To draw out a master hunter, the bait had to be irresistible. She decided to be the bait herself. On the morning of November 8th at 5:42 a.m., Lyudmila arrived at the front line. She wasn't wearing her sniper camouflage. Instead, she had donned an officer's greatcoat she borrowed from a dead lieutenant. It was too big for her, but from 300 meters away, the silhouette was unmistakable. A Soviet officer standing carelessly in the open. She positioned herself near the command post, fully exposed. Her rifle was 4 meters away, propped behind a pile of rubble, already aimed at her primary suspect, the destroyed church tower. The plan was simple and terrifying. She would stand there until the German fired. If she was wrong about his location, she would be dead before the sound of the shot reached her. If she was right, she calculated she would have roughly 1.5 to 2 seconds between the bullet passing her and the German disappearing to reload or relocate. She stood there, the transcript of her life records that she stood in the open for 17 minutes. Imagine those minutes. The wind blowing cold across the ruins, the distant thud of artillery, the itch to flinch, to crouch, to run. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was suicide. She had to keep her hands relaxed at her sides to look natural. If she looked tense, the German might suspect a trap. She had to look like an arrogant, careless officer surveying the lines. Minute after minute ticked by. Nothing moved in the church tower. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe he wasn't there. Maybe he was watching her through his crosshairs right now, waiting for her to turn her head so he could put a bullet in her ear. Sweat ran down her back despite the cold. Then at 5:59 a.m., the silence broke. She heard the crack of the rifle before she felt the air displace. It was the distinct sound of a Mauser K98. The bullet snapped past her head, so close it parted her hair. She didn't freeze. She dove, but she didn't dive back into cover. She dove left, toward her rifle. She hit the ground hard, ignoring the pain, and her hands found the weapon instantly, muscle memory taking over. She swung the barrel toward the church tower and looked through the scope. There he was, 300 meters away, on the 3rd floor of the Yatus bell tower. A figure was moving back from the opening, retreating into the shadows. He had taken the shot, missed, and was now repositioning. Lyudmila had maybe 3 seconds before he was gone forever. There was no time for mathematics now, no time to calculate windage or elevation. She didn't aim in the traditional sense. She simply pointed and fired. It was an instinct shot, the kind instructors tell you never to take because it usually misses. The Mosin Nagant kicked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the figure in the tower jerk violently, stagger, and then fall backward into the darkness. She stayed down. She didn't know if he was dead or just wounded. She chambered another round and waited. 3 minutes passed, then 10. The sun began to rise higher. 15 minutes later, Lieutenant Boris and a clearing team entered the church. They moved cautiously up the stairs, rifles ready. Lyudmila watched through her scope as they reached the bell tower. A moment later, Boris appeared in the opening and waved. Target down. Confirmed kill. When they examined the body, they found a German sniper with a single shot through the chest. His rifle was a masterpiece, a Mauser with a custom Zeiss scope, still warm from the shot he had taken at Lyudmila. In his pocket was a logbook listing nearly 100 kills. His name, according to Soviet records, was Erwin König, or similar spelling in the transcript Vinkoig, a headhunter sent specifically to kill Soviet snipers. Whether his name was König or Thorvald, or if he was a composite of several German aces, didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that he was the best the Wehrmacht had to offer, and he had done everything right. He had perfect concealment, he had tracked his target, and he had taken the shot. But he had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the woman standing in the open. He thought she was just another careless officer. He didn't realize she was the trap. There is a cynicism that often creeps into the history books when we talk about Soviet kill counts. Western historians have debated whether Lady Death was real, or if her numbers were inflated by commissars desperate for a hero. They look at the number, 309 confirmed kills, and they see a statistic that looks too perfect, too high. But while you can forge a logbook and you can fabricate a legend, you cannot fake the scar tissue of a mortar round to the face. Lyudmila Pavlichenko wasn't shooting from a comfortable tower in the rear. She was in the mud, in the freezing cold, and often she was the one bleeding. Her service record isn't just a list of shots fired. It is a catalog of near-death experiences. She paid for every single one of those 309 kills with her own flesh. The first payment came early, in September 1941. A mortar round exploded near her position, sending hot iron into her arm and shoulder. It was the kind of injury that gets a soldier sent to the rear for a week of rest. Lyudmila had it, bandaged in the field, and was back on her rifle the next morning. 3 months later, in December, the Germans tried to bury her. An artillery shell landed just 10 meters from her position. The blast didn't hit her with shrapnel, but the overpressure wave knocked her unconscious for 2 minutes. When she woke up, disoriented and concussed, she refused medical evacuation. She stayed in the line. By February 1942, the law of averages was catching up to her. During a barrage, a German 80T Midila anti-aircraft gun, fired in a ground roll, sent an airburst over her sector. She was caught in the open. Shrapnel tore through her calf. This wasn't a graze. It was a debilitating wound that left her immobile for a week. Most soldiers would have taken the ticket home. Lyudmila forced herself to walk after 10 days and was back in combat within 3 weeks. But the war finally collected its due in June 1942. Sevastopol was crumbling. The German artillery was relentless, walking mortar rounds across the Soviet positions in a grid pattern. Lyudmila was huddled in a shallow trench, too shallow. A round landed close enough to spray her with jagged metal fragments. This time, she didn't just get up. The shrapnel hit her face. It slashed open her cheek, fractured her jaw, and damaged her eye. There was blood everywhere. The medics who reached her thought she might die from the shock alone. She was evacuated to a military hospital in the city. The surgeons managed to save her eye and they stitched up her face, but the damage was done. She would carry the scars for the rest of her life. This injury marked the end of Lyudmila the soldier and the beginning of Lyudmila the symbol. The Soviet High Command looked at her chart and made a cold calculation. She was 25 years old. She had 309 kills. She was the most famous female soldier in the Red Army. If she went back to the front and died in a muddy ditch, it would be a propaganda disaster. They decided she was too valuable to risk. In July 1942, less than a month after her face was stitched back together, she was pulled from the front. Lyudmila was furious. She argued with her commanders. She told them her injuries were superficial, that she could still shoot, that the motherland needed experienced snipers. She had never lost her nerve, never broken down, never asked for a transfer. But in the Red Army, orders are orders. The woman who had hunted the deadliest German snipers was stripped of her rifle and handed a train ticket. Her war was over. The university student who became a hunter was about to be forced into a new role, a diplomat. In late 1942, the Soviet Union took its deadliest weapon off the battlefield and put her on a stage. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was ordered to trade her Mosin Nagant for a microphone. Her new mission was arguably harder than hunting in the ruins of Sevastopol. She had to convince the Western allies, Britain and the United States, to open a second front in Europe. Stalin needed the West to invade France to relieve the pressure on the Red Army. To get that support, he sent Lyudmila on a goodwill tour. She hated it. She was a soldier, not a performer. She felt out of place. A killer paraded in front of diplomats who had never smelled trench rot or cordite. Her first stop was London in September 1942. There, she met Winston Churchill. The British Prime Minister, a man who had seen war himself, looked at the young woman standing before him and asked the question that haunted civilians. What did it feel like to kill 309 people? Lyudmila didn't give him a poetic answer. She gave him the truth. She told him it felt like mathematics. Distance, wind, target movement. You solve the equation, you pull the trigger. Churchill couldn't accept that. He insisted she must feel something. Guilt, pride, something. Lyudmila looked at the leader of the British Empire and said simply, "I feel tired." But if London was weary, Washington was a circus. When Lyudmila arrived in the United States in October 1942, she stepped into a culture clash that was almost comical. The American press didn't know what to do with her. They called her the girl sniper and the most dangerous woman in the world. They treated her like an exotic exhibit at a zoo, a woman who did a man's job better than the men. While the American public, especially the women, were fascinated by this feminist icon, the American military establishment was deeply skeptical. You have to understand the mindset of a U.S. Army officer in 1942. Women in the American military were nurses or clerks. They were not infantry. They certainly weren't snipers. Generals and colonels looked at this 25-year-old woman and openly laughed at her record. They called it Soviet propaganda. They said it was physically impossible for one person to kill 309 enemy soldiers in 11 months. They whispered that she was a myth, or worse, a man in disguise. Lyudmila didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself. She let the bureaucracy do the talking. The U.S. War Department, driven by suspicion, decided to investigate her claims. They ran a cross-reference of her reported engagement zones against captured German casualty reports and radio intercepts. The numbers matched. The Germans hadn't just reported losing men. They had reported losing specific officers to a Russian Hellcat in the exact sectors where Lyudmila had been operating. The skepticism evaporated. She wasn't lying. The one person who didn't need convincing was Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady saw past the uniform and the kill count. She saw the human being beneath the Lady Death moniker. Roosevelt took Lyudmila under her wing, arranging rallies in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. For 6 months, Lyudmila toured the safety of America while her friends died back home. She gave hundreds of speeches. She smiled for thousands of photographs. By the time the tour ended in 1943, she was more exhausted than she had been in the trenches. She had won the PR war, but she had lost her anonymity forever. She was no longer just a sniper. She was history. But as she boarded the plane to return to the Soviet Union, the only thing she wanted was to go back to Sevastopol. She wanted to fight, but there was nothing to go back to. Sevastopol had fallen. The city was German. The war had moved on, and so had she. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko returned to the Soviet Union in March 1943, she didn't just fade into the background. She was assigned to training duty, where she took the raw recruits of the Red Army and taught them the lessons that had kept her alive in Odessa and Sevastopol. She taught hundreds of students in Moscow and Kiev, passing on the specific techniques of dual nests, decoy placement, and psychological warfare. The impact was immediate and profound. By 1944, the rigid, defensive Soviet sniper doctrine that had gotten her friends killed was dead. It was replaced by the aggressive, predator-focused tactics Lyudmila had pioneered. Her students, and the students they taught, stopped hiding and started hunting. This shift in philosophy increased German casualty rates, and more importantly, drastically dropped the casualty rates for Soviet snipers. But her influence didn't stop at the Soviet border. Today, if you look closely at the training manuals of the world's most elite military units, you will find Lyudmila's fingerprints on the pages. The U.S. Marine Corps Scout Sniper School teaches variations of her decoy methods. The British SAS includes her tactics in their counter-sniper doctrine. The Israeli Defense Forces study her urban engagements as case studies. The irony is that none of these organizations mention her by name. Her crazy trick, using herself as bait and manipulating enemy expectations, has been absorbed so thoroughly into general military doctrine that it has been divorced from its creator. She changed the way the world fights, even if the world forgot who showed them how. Lyudmila died on October 10, 1974, at the age of 58. She was buried with full military honors, a hero of the Soviet Union. But the true weight of her life wasn't in the medals. It was in the number 309. To the history books, 309 is a high score. To Lyudmila, it was a heavy burden. In interviews after the war, she admitted that every kill haunted her. She remembered the faces she saw through her scope. She didn't kill for sport. She killed because she had to solve the mathematics of survival to protect her country. If you visit the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow today, you can see her rifle behind glass, the stock still bearing the initials she carved into it. Next to it is a photograph of Lyudmila at 24, standing in the ruins of Odessa. She looks tired in the photo. She looks determined. But mostly, she looks like a woman who made a choice. She chose to reject the rules that didn't work. She chose to risk everything on her own terms. And because she didn't just survive the war. She taught history how to hunt.